Welcome, everyone. We're going to let folks make their way in from the waiting room, and we will get started in just a moment. All right, well, welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us live today for our Lunch and Learn Introducing the Place Justice Project, a statewide truth-seeking and historical recovery initiative of the Permanent Commission. And welcome to all of the viewers joining us on YouTube. We are really looking forward to today's conversation because who gets memorialized through place names and statues and historical markers is really a strong indication of a society's values and its dominant sense of collective identity. Whose memory is visible and celebrated? Whose has been erased or misinterpreted? How do the politics and the practices of public remembrance and forgetting continue to impact our communities today? The Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Indigenous, and Tribal Populations has launched a Place Justice Project that seeks to engage Wabanaki and Maine communities in examining a wide range of commemorative practices to better understand and respond to the ways in which racialized and Indigenous populations are represented or absent from the narratives inscribed on our natural and built environment. With us today to introduce this project is Meadow Dibble, who leads the Place Justice Project and serves as Executive Director of the Atlantic Black Box. You may recognize Meadow and Atlantic Black Box from a previous Lunch and Learn. She is joined by Erika Arthur, the Place Justice Coordinator or Place Justice Consultant, and a policy analyst at the Catherine Cutler Institute, and also by Angela Okafor, who's Director of Community Engagement at the Permanent Commission. Thank you all for being with us today. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today. We will hear from our speakers first and then tackle your questions in a Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait, though. You can send your questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you. I will compile all the questions, synthesize those with similar themes, and ask as many of them as we possibly can in the Q&A following the presentation. We ask that you please do not message our speakers directly, as we want them to be able to focus on the presentation, not the chat box. If you have any technical challenges today, you can message Will Sedlak and he will help you out. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns, including that one with Meadow a couple of months back. Couple of years back, it runs together. Thank you again for joining us. And Angela, I believe you are going to kick it off, so I will turn things over to you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Good morning, everybody. My name is Angela Okafor. Can you hear me? All right, I wanted to make sure. So like she said, I am the Director of Outreach and Community Engagement for the Permanent Commission. So the Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Tribal, and Indigenous Populations of Maine was established by LD 777 in 2018, and it was established with certain missions, which primarily is to examine racism across all systems in our state, to advance strategies and policies to eliminate disparities, and to create opportunities for equitable and just outcome for the marginalized groups, which are the racial, the indigenous, and the tribal populations of Maine. Also, this same statute allows the Permanent Commission to advise the 3 branches of government to submit legislation, to conduct public hearings, research, and to educate and engage the public. One of those ways of, one of those duties and missions of a Permanent Commission is the Place Justice project, which is why we are here. And I will turn that over to Meadow to take it off from there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming today to hear a bit about our very exciting Place Justice project. We only have time today to really touch the surface, but we're most excited to welcome your questions and comments during the Q&A portion of this event. So please consider what we're about to show you as really just a very brief preview. I am going to share my screen now. Can everyone see that okay? Terrific. Place Justice, as Kathleen and Angela mentioned, is a statewide truth-seeking and historical recovery initiative of the Permanent Commission. So it is under the auspices of the Permanent Commission that a wonderful and very wise Place Justice Advisory Council has formed. And we refer to it as PJAC, but this advisory council is made up of tribal leaders, knowledge keepers from Maine's intergenerational, multi-generational Black families. It's made up of historians, GIS specialists, facilitators of dialogue and cross-cultural conversations, and many others. And so it's under the guidance of this advisory council that the Place Justice Project is forming. We see this as a multi-dimensional project that will evolve over time. And I do really want to stress, this is not a top-down, state-imposed project. This is really a community-engaged research undertaking that centers communities around the state, many of which are already doing important work related to place justice. We have launched a free series of panel discussions and film screenings that will run through June. If you missed our launch event in February and the screening of Fighting Indians, you can find information on both of those on our website. We'll include a link in the chat. The aim of this programming series and of the project as a whole is to really raise awareness about Indigenous and Black histories in this place we now call Maine, histories that have long been buried and effaced. And we're looking to invite the public to consider the impact and legacies, not only of the theft of land and labor, but also the theft of memory. By launching this statewide inquiry into what we're calling the memory scape, we're looking to engage the public in considering the often complex and contentious issues related to offensive place names and other problematic commemorative practices in the state. Memory, like race, is socially constructed. So when we talk about a memory scape, what we're pointing to is the commemorative landscape that surrounds us, but actually that often goes relatively unnoticed. So a memory scape includes monuments, statues, museums, historical markers, street signs, geographic place names, cemeteries, official narratives, and other forms of remembrance. We see a very, very strong connection between a sense of belonging and the presence in that memory scape of a people and their inclusion in the official narrative. And as you know, Indigenous people have been here for thousands of generations. Black people, we're learning more and more every day, have been here since the first Europeans arrived on these shores. Both of these populations have survived attempted genocide and enslavement, and they've done that through resilience, creative survival. They've continued to exist here and to contribute meaningfully to defining the nature and character of this place and to building truly our communities. And yet that presence and those contributions have not been included in our memory scape, right? Nor in our official narratives, in the histories that are researched and taught and reflected in the built environment that surrounds us. A little bit then about the origins of the Place Justice Project. Some of you may recall back in 2020, it was revealed that a number of islands in Maine continued to bear the N-word, a racial slur against Black people, in their name in 2020. And this despite legislation that had passed back in 1977, attracting national attention because it really was groundbreaking work by legislator Gerald Talbot, Maine's first African-American legislator. And it was his daughter, almost 40 years later, who learned that her father's work, this landmark bill, hadn't been effectively carried out because those offensive, deeply offensive place names continued to exist on the landscape. In addition to Gerald Talbot's work in the 70s, there were a number of other bills, notably in the 2000s, to eradicate the S word from Maine place names, the S word being a derogatory term that is deeply offensive and harmful to Indigenous women. Similarly, those acts passed, the first in 2000 and then in 2009, sort of a corrective measure. And yet, once again, it was in 2020 that we realized that S word names had not been totally effaced from places around Maine. A couple of them remained. So then the question is, where is the gap? Where is the breakdown in the system? How did these place names come to be in the first place? Especially given, that the presence of these populations in the case of people of African heritage has largely gone untold over the centuries. How did these place names come to exist, and how is it that there have been these systemic failures to eradicate them? I'd like you to take a look at this map that was made by Lincoln Mullen. This depicts the spread of US slavery in the United States. It's a really interesting interactive feature that you can find online, and I'm happy to share the link afterwards during the Q&A. But take a look at Maine. What do you notice? So this is this depicts the very beginning of the interactive maps, where it takes its departure using data from the 1790 census. And what this indicates is that there was no slavery in Maine in 1790. There were no enslaved people here. And you can see that that is also the case for Vermont and Massachusetts. This creates a misperception that there was no slavery in Maine. If we rely solely on data from the 1790 census, we come away thinking that Maine did not practice slavery, when in fact it did for a very long period of time, as did Massachusetts and Vermont. It's just that Massachusetts, of which Maine was a part until 1820, its Supreme Court in 1783 determined that slavery was incompatible with the Massachusetts state constitution. Does that mean that slavery ended in Massachusetts and Maine at that time? No, it does not. And I point this out because it's this sort of, it's these sorts of partial data that contribute to the perception that there was not slavery in Maine, there was not a Black population in Maine in prior centuries. And similarly, we have this phenomenon of whereby we have forgotten, right, progressively over the centuries, the presence of Indigenous populations to the point where many people, most people, believe that the tribes were wiped out long ago, that they do not continue to exist and thrive. This is a map that was compiled from data collected by researcher Vana Carmona, who's collaborating on our Place Justice project. Vana is the author of the Prince Project, and over the past 8 years, after learning that her own ancestors were enslavers here in Maine, she began researching slavery in Maine and has a database now that contains information on over 2,000 people of color of African heritage or of mixed African and Indigenous heritage who were here in Maine prior to 1800, which is to say that the great majority of those people would have been enslaved at least for a portion of their lives, if not for their entire lives. So part of the work of the Place Justice Project is to understand how those place names that were alluded to earlier, the N-word, the S-word, the Negro place names came to exist. But to do that, we really decided to zoom out and ask a broader question. So we're doing a statewide comprehensive systematic inventory of place names in Maine. So these include geographic features, islands, summits, rivers, also populated places, towns, and counties, stopping short of street names. We're using data from multiple sources, the basis of which is coming from the U.S. Geographic Board of Names, but we're pulling from multiple sources that speak to the origins of these place names, and we're performing an analysis to try to get a better understanding of how these places got their names, and what we're coming away understanding through our preliminary analysis is that the great majority of places in Maine are commemoratively named. So they're named after people. This is just, as I said, a preliminary result from our findings related to Androscoggin County. We're doing this analysis for each of the 16 counties. As you can see, place names in Maine fall into about 4 different categories, the largest of which is people. Many places in Maine are named after other places. Generally, those are places in Europe. So in the case of Androscoggin County, we found places named after places in England, Wales, and Scotland. Of the people who are commemorated through place names, the overwhelming majority are white men. In Androscoggin County, there are no places named after women, period. Here is a map that shows all places in Maine that formerly bore the N-word in their names, and the places that currently still go by names, including the word Negro. I want to point out that places with Negro in the name, many of them historically contained the N-word. So Negro was a replacement name for the N-word. And many of these places that, with Negro in the name are still referred to with the N-word. Here is a map of places formerly bearing the S word in their names. You can see that there's a great big concentration right around Moosehead Lake. The last of these, you can see right in the middle of the map, No Name Island. That is a place that was just renamed when the U.S. Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, passed a secretarial order that eliminated the S word from place names across the US. The fact that this place name still contained the S word in Maine up until this year is indicative of those sort of systemic failures to eradicate these offensive terms through policy. And so Erika will speak shortly to precisely to how that affects our approach and our decision to take a multifaceted approach in not just changing policy and streamlining the regulatory sort of process around name change, but working at the grassroots level with communities on these issues. No Name Island is it's an unfortunate consequence of just something falling through the cracks. When the federal authorities went to change this name, there was no suggested replacement name. So this is the sort of thing that we want to avoid, because that place could have bore, its replacement name could have been an Indigenous name, for example. And I just want to give you here a sense of sort of how Maine's profile with respect to offensive names in relation to other US states. And here I'm just showing you information from a data set that we've been compiling related to the word Negro in place names. But as you can see, Maine has 11 places bearing Negro in the name. Compare that to Alabama, for example. We're more or less on par with Alabama. Georgia has fewer Negro place names than we do. Now look at the New England states. Connecticut, just 3. Massachusetts, 2. Vermont, 2. Even Mississippi only has 5. So this is part of our work as well, is to look at Maine's profile in relation to that of other states. And one clear thing that is emerging as we're doing this analysis is that Maine has the incidence rate of offensive names in Maine resembles that of Western states much more than it does that of other New England states. We are an outlier among New England states. Now I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Erika.
Thanks, Meadow, and thanks everyone for being here. So I'm actually going to skip this slide in the interest of time, because it's just another way of visualizing all of the pieces of our work. And I'm going to move on to this piece that Meadow alluded to, which is just the centrality of engaging communities in this process, rather than just, doing a bureaucratic process of replacing a name. This is our opportunity to address place names and commemorative symbols as an opportunity to delve deeper. We see those symbols and representations as just the tip of the iceberg, the visible indicator of the deeper culture, as you heard in the introduction, of the values that are represented. And so it's an opportunity to, move toward a more transformative process than just replacing a name. So these are just some of the ways that the Place Justice Project engages community. We're developing opportunities online for folks to give input. That is a work in progress. Hopefully will be more robust in the future, but it exists now on the Permanent Commission's website. There is a place for that. We're organizing listening sessions, sometimes standalone, sometimes in collaboration with other organizations and events, conducting individual interviews, and then this piece of serving as a connector across communities and between communities and resources. This in part because of that advisory council that we're lucky to have. There are some incredible folks there who can serve as resources for communities, and then communities learning from each other as they engage in these processes. And then this last point is primarily right now in the form of our event series, which we'll put the link for in the chat in just a moment. And then just very briefly, this last piece, the vision that we're driving toward is an expansive one, but we really feel like this is where we're heading with this work. And then these are the ways that we're, this is our foundation for how we're moving toward that vision. And I'll just say that we're learning from and building on the work that has come before us, folks like the Maine Wabanaki Child Welfare Truth and Reconciliation Commission, historical recovery initiatives like the Slave Rex Project, all kinds of other work that we're building on and drawing from and learning from in order to do this work with integrity. And that last point, just driving toward a more transformative trajectory rather than just kind of changing the names on a map. We're looking for deeper change through these avenues. So I know we did not leave very many minutes for questions, but clearly we're excited and there's so many directions that we want to go with this, and hope you'll stay tuned for more.
Thank you all so much. I am really excited to get into questions in just a minute, and we already have a terrific bunch. You know what they say about great minds thinking alike. There are definitely some themes emerging here. So we'll do our best to combine those specific questions into the broader themes. And of course, please keep sending them to me through the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. But I do want to just let everybody know that later on this afternoon, you will get a follow-up email with the link to this recording and a whole bunch of other links. So the link to find out more about the Place Justice Project and to see those upcoming events. There is an event coming up just this Tuesday on regional and national initiatives to address racist place names. So you'll see the sign up link for that. And I think we'll also have a link to that Atlantic Black Box project, that Lunch and Learn that we did with Meadow several sessions back. So you can go back into the archives and explore some other ways to get involved in understanding the history that's all around us. Going right towards that, Meadow, I love that notion of a memory scape. Is that a concept that's been around for a while that I haven't heard of? Is it a new thing? It's beautiful.
Thank you, Kathleen. It's out there, sort of, but it may be something that we have at least had some part in coining.
I love that. I love that. And I love that it sounds like, thinking about the program that's coming up on Tuesday, that while Maine is an unfortunate outlier in the number of names and percentage of names that we need to be thinking about, it sounds like we're not alone in this work. Are you seeing that the idea of memory scape catch on? And what does that do for us to think about things in those terms?
Yeah, great question. I guess I'd separate it into two answers. One is, yes, absolutely. There is increased commitment on the part of folks around the United States to work on eradicating offensive place names and dealing with harmful and derogatory terms. That work is taking place, at multiple levels. There's certainly great leadership from Secretary Deborah Haaland. It was very exciting. I mean, she had been working on place names as an elected official in New Mexico prior to being tapped for the Secretary of the Interior position. And as soon as she was in office, she passed two very important secretarial orders. One, the first 3404, was to eradicate the S word, as I mentioned, from place names around the country. And that has just, in the last couple months, become effective. The other, 3405, is a secretarial order that creates an advisory body on reconciliation in place names. And that body is meant to really serve in an ongoing way to deliberate the complexities of these issues. For example, when it comes to the word Negro, does this constitute an offensive name? Should the word Negro be categorized as offensive? Or is there perhaps a different designation, derogatory, that might be attached to it that would indicate to states that they need to do work at the state level with communities to hold a public process around this question, and rather than have a sort of a top-down federal ban, for example, as in the case of the S word. So we're, I think, very fortunate to have that leadership at the national level. There are states, as you will hear if you join us on Tuesday, and I very much hope you will. This promises to be an excellent, really informative event, important for us here in Maine. There are states that have been working to on questions related to offensive place names for many decades. Texas is one of them. So it was back again in the 1970s that that elected officials in Texas passed legislation to eradicate the word Negro from place names in Texas. And there were 19 of them at the time, both Negro and the N-word place names. That legislation passed, and yet it was not implemented. Like in Maine, things fell through the cracks, but in a very big way in Texas. And we'll get to hear directly from Commissioner Rodney Ellis, who is county commissioner for the county that includes Houston, and who worked on that legislation back in the 70s. He will be at our event on Tuesday to tell us the whole story and how he and his colleagues managed, finally, 30 years later, not 30, sorry, more than that, to actually get this accomplished. so these are really important stories that we can learn from here in Maine. The other part of your question, though, I'll be brief about sort of doing an audit or an inventory of the memory scape. You know, I don't see a tremendous amount of that happening in the United States. The examples that we have been drawing from in sort of formulating our thinking around this are taking place elsewhere around the world. Notably in England, there has been really important work in the past couple of years to look at all of the holdings, sort of the historic preservation holdings, and they performed a comprehensive inventory to establish which of those holdings were had connections to slavery. And it was that audit that really formed the basis of much of what we've been hearing recently about, for example, the royal family's connections to slavery. These things, of course, they've been known by many for a very long time. They simply haven't been part of public discourse and conversation. And so bringing it really to the surface is what this sort of, data compilation, can actually help facilitate.
That is just fascinating. And I'm even more excited about Tuesday's program now, hearing that story of what we'll be learning about. But thinking about that process of first recognizing that the ties between the names and the people that they commemorate or don't commemorate. And there's that sort of initial, well, we didn't know, right? I didn't know that was offensive. I didn't know that person who the street I grew up on or whatever it was, like, it was just the street I grew up on. I didn't know. There's that first level of learning. And then there's the learning about why it matters. And that strikes me as something that people in communities might go through at different paces. And I wonder what you're seeing about, maybe lessons from countries that are a little ahead of us. Is there a gap between recognizing that something is offensive and understanding and really being motivated to change it? Or do those follow as neatly as I would like you to tell me they do?
I can take this in one way, and maybe you'll have another angle on it, Meadow, but I think this kind of goes back to what we were just talking about in terms of that category of offensive versus derogatory. And a way that I have found really useful is thinking about harmful place names or just the importance of participation. And that's one piece that we're working on as well, is like looking at what the process is at the federal level and how that interfaces with local level. Like if you go to change a name, how does that actually go from point A to point B? And is there anything built in there for consulting, say, with the tribes or with those folks who are most impacted by a name? So in this case, with Negro Island, what's the avenue, how much effort, how much time is allotted for having meaningful conversation or dialogue about that? And so I think that in some ways it's like that part of the gap is that there's not space for even understanding the impact. And so the category offensive in some ways is a little wishy-washy. I think, it has utility, but there's like, what do you do with that? How do you determine offense? And that's not a category necessarily that we're used to acting on, I would say. And so I think situating this within larger conversations around harm and then repair around that harm, I think is really helpful. And I think I'll just, contextualize this at the federal level as well. Like if you think about Secretary Holland's priorities, I think it's really telling that, you know, within the landscape of the place names, the reconciliation or truth seeking and historical research that's happening around boarding schools in this country. And then the very current and very serious issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Like, if you look at all of those things together, you start to see that, like, place names, particularly the S word, which are, if you look at the West, like, extraordinary number of S word place names, you start to see the pattern and the relationships between these different, seemingly maybe unrelated struggles. But as long as, you know, we will tolerate, you know, murder rates of Indigenous women that are like astronomical and horrific, and we're tolerating place names like that, there's a direct through line. So I think that that's a really important way of framing it, is around how, you know, how is this harmful? And then what is the process for understanding how to change that?
That is a really helpful frame. And I think many of us, maybe one of our first sort of forays into this work was around mascots, right? And I know that was one of the programs that you did early in the Place Justice Project, and sort of documenting and really demonstrating that harm that is done when a community, a population is turned into a mascot as opposed to recognized for who they really are. And I wonder, am I right on that? Did that come first before place names, or is that just the way that I learned about it?
Well, the bill to eliminate racist mascots in Maine, it passed in 2019. I actually had the great honor of being present on the day that that bill was passed, because my daughter was serving as a page, as a fourth grader. And it was an incredible historic moment. Of course, the groundwork for that legislation had been laid for many years prior. There had been a tremendous amount of advocacy work done by members of the tribal community to prepare for that moment. And interestingly, that bill passed after, you know, the last holdout had changed its name. So we're in a different situation with place names, but they very much are of a piece, and that's why in designing this series of events, you know, we do bring in folks and films that really spotlight both issues. We will have another film later in the series, I'm happy to say, on mascots as well. Very, you know, which is promising. And we do see progress. We see that these you know, sometimes very contentious struggles at the local level can lead to very positive change and a greater sense of belonging. But it can bring up some very ugly stuff, as those of you who saw the film Fighting Indians 2 weeks ago will have noted. And you know, I'd also like to mention the community of Castine in Maine, that for a couple of years now, you know, has been doing work to, you know, hold conversations around the place names Upper and Lower Negro Island, which are right there at the mouth of the Bagaduce River. This process has been ongoing, as I said, for a couple of years, since a petition was brought by an individual. The petition went straight to the federal level, the USBGN, before being brought to the municipality. And this is the sort of, it's that when something comes to a Maine community from elsewhere, whether it's from a state agency, a federal authority, or from a visitor passing through who takes offense at something, there tends to be a sort of a local control kind of a response, like, please do not come in here and tell us what to do. On the other hand, what we have discovered, to our great, we've been very, very pleased to discover is just a whole lot of willingness on the part of Castine residents to hold these conversations, to ask the tough questions, to consult with folks from the Black community, folks from the Indigenous communities. The problem is often that they don't have those pathways are not clear for consultation. So that is one aspect of the work that we're really looking to assist with. And just one last point, I think it bears on this question of, like, where does the resistance come from? We often hear, people will say, whether we're talking about mascots or place names, but it's always been that way. And if you change it, you're changing history. So another aspect of our work really is to show folks that place names have been changing throughout the centuries. Really, there is no stability when it comes to place names. There's just a lot of transformation constantly. And that to sort of help allay the fears that we're going to lose something very important to our identity if we accept to make this change.
I'm so glad you brought up the work that's happening in Castine. We were able to host the director of the Historical Society for a lunch and learn a few sessions back, and we'll include a link to that in the follow-up email this afternoon, because it really is such an interesting story about I think for many of us, when we learned history in elementary school, it was something that was in the past, right? It was like, that's the definition of history, it's over. But that sense of no, the work that we do, the way that we relate to our history, that's an ongoing work in progress, and that our local historical societies can really help us update our understanding of the past. It's not rewriting, it's not losing, it's just evolving. And I thought that was a really interesting program. So encourage everybody to go back and look at that. And I think you're right, Meadow, that there's this, first round of resistance. It's always been that way. And then there's the second round of just, I can't wrap my head around it, right? The name has been officially changed, but I still say, oh, well, the old such and such, or and I give directions this way too. So it's, but how do we help? Are there strategies to help us accelerate the adoption of the new name, the next name, or is it just something that takes time for people to catch up with?
Yeah, I would say, that's why place justice is just one spoke in a large wheel of work, right? Like, if you change a name and there's nothing else happening, for folks to understand where that's coming from, to grapple with their sense of loss potentially around that other older name or mascot or whatever it is. Like, and here I just want to be explicit that, like, when we talk about this, we're talking about white Mainers, right? White non-native folks. Like, I don't want to just keep slipping into that, like, language of the general public. So I think when we're talking about resistance and we're talking about holding on to ideas of a past, we're talking about identity and story, and what do those do for people. And I think that, you know, necessarily this work will have to engage with that. I think, you know, like we said, we're in phase 1 of, we often joke, this is an idea for phase 46 or whatever, but clearly this is part of a larger landscape of work that, you know, we've seen myriad examples of kind of, you know, coming more into the light. Obviously, this is work that's been going on for generations, but in the last several years, I think, of course, there's been more visibility and more people are asking questions and engaging in ways that maybe they hadn't before. And so this is part of all of that work. So if, you know, that's in part why, yeah, we're not interested in just like changing a name to something and saying, you know, CL, let's move on to the next one. Like we're interested in that deeper work that gets folks into like a different kind of relationship with each other and with the place where we live. And it's a longer haul proposition, I guess.
I really appreciate that, Erika. Thank you. And I know that means that we have to be patient for some of the resources to evolve as well. But if there are folks who are listening, and we've got a bunch of comments in the chat right now about, you know, well, I know of this place that should be changed, or that name that should be changed, or this is really hard I don't know how to bring this to my community. What do you suggest for people who want to jump to, you know, get a jump on step 1 so that we're ready to do step 46 when we get there?
We totally welcome. We're actively, you know, encouraging people to contribute their ideas and also what they're seeing at the local level. We have a couple of Google forms that are designed to elicit that sort of information. And so I'll make sure that you have those to include in the email that will go out after this. And I can also go pull that up in just a sec. Thank you. So please, yes, you know, are there problematic historic plaques in your town? Are there, you know, street signs and statues that that you feel need to be addressed? But also just more broadly, what is your take on place justice itself? Like what is place justice to you, and what do you think it would take to achieve it?
Boy, this follow-up email is going to be full of good resources. Thank you. Thank you. Angela, I have a question for you about the work of the Permanent Commission. This feels like a lot and vitally important work, but I have a feeling that it is not the only work that the Permanent Commission is doing. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the other projects underway?
Thank you for the question. So the place justice is a huge part of it. Work we are doing. We are doing some work in restorative justice, but primarily most of our work to are community informed, which is why the importance of what Meadow and Erika does here is very important. We are doing so many other collaborative work with several other agencies. We are working on building several hubs. We have worked on passing a law on racial impact statements. The list goes on and on. I could send you a link or a comprehensive list, but our work is not a closed-end work. We are still progressing. We are still building on several other things that we are doing and we expect to do.
That would be just terrific. I'd love to be able to share that ongoing work with with everybody who's joined today? And are there opportunities for folks to get involved and support that work? Clearly, when things come to the legislature, we can get out there and give testimony and talk to our lawmakers about making sure that we're supporting the work of the Permanent Commission. But are there other things that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, basically, yes. But when you talked about supporting legislation, that is most times one of the best ways. Getting involved in works like this, attending events like this, it helps, because when you are more informed, it helps you with, supporting our policy work. But also, we are still working on being able to get financial donations, but there are other ways we could get financial donations. For example, we are planning a Juneteenth event this year, and we are, there is always need for financial support. So I could send you a link we're still working, because I'm working with Meadow too, with some other state agencies, but it's something that, people could look out for. And we are still always taking financial donations or some in-kind time, but also when it comes to legislative work, we are always, which is where my outreach and community engagement work comes in, because we are able to get people that are relevant to testifying, to support our legislation, or at least people to push their representatives to, find ways to work with us. But also we host listening sessions every year. Last year, we did the first in-person listening session here in Bangor. The idea of that is for us to be able to create safe space for people to interact with the community, to know what the community needs, how the community wants it, and how we can work alongside the community to not just advise the three arms of government, but this work is what helps us inform the work we do legislatively, policy-wise, and every other thing we do. So there is always a way to get involved. We have a website, which I can send you the link to. Let me write down the links I'm going to be sending. So yeah, we are also on Facebook. You can follow us. We share information. We share our events coming. We share efforts that we're making. You can follow our meetings. On our website, there is a calendar. Our meetings are usually public meetings, so we always post them out there. We have several subcommittees. So whatever your interest is really, or whatever your strength is, you feel like you can contribute. We have the community engagement committee. We have the research committee, the policy committee, and so we have the finance and operation, which is like the executive arm of the, So there is always a lot of ways to get involved. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your work. Angela, Erika, Meadow, we are just so grateful for you taking the time today to walk us through Place Justice, the Permanent Commission, and the ways that we can really bring this work to life in our communities across Maine and beyond. Thanks to everybody who joined today. You've heard lots of references to that link will be coming, so keep an eye on your inbox this afternoon. And I encourage you to forward that follow-up email with the link to this program and all of those resources, and reach out to a friend and say, hey, you want to tune into that Tuesday evening place names program with me and have a conversation afterwards. Feels like a really powerful way that we can share this work more broadly. I'm so grateful to all of you. We will be back in this space next week to explore the role of Maine's forests in protecting biodiversity and our climate. Maine is so many things. It's our people, our communities, and yes, our forests and our climate as well. So I'm going to give you 2 quick facts if you're on the fence about whether to tune in next week. The world lost 200 million acres of forest between 1960 and 2019. That's fact number 1. Fact number 2, Maine has 17.5 million acres of forest. We are the most heavily forested state in the nation. We will welcome Sally Stockwell from Maine Audubon and Dave Publicover from the Appalachian Mountain Club next week to help us figure out what that means for climate change, for biodiversity, for forest policy here in Maine. So hope to see you all then. Until then, get ready for another big storm tomorrow, and you'll have lots to keep you busy making your way through the resources that we'll share, so you don't have to brave the elements if you don't want to. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Meadow, Angela, Erika, thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thanks, everyone.